Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get this garden hour started. We are super excited that you all could join us today. If this is your first time joining us for the garden hour, welcome. If you are a garden hour regular, we're happy to have you back. We kicked off the 2021 series in mid-February, and this is our third presentation of the year. We are super excited to talk about pruning like a pro, trees and shrubs. This series is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Kelsey Hattisall, and I will be your host today, and I am the horticulture agent in the River Valley District. This webinar series has allowed us to provide online extension education related to horticulture and gardening in an innovative and engaging way. Hope everyone involved that has been involved in the development of this series is a professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline, but most of all, we just have a love for gardening and the natural environment. Before we get started, we do have a couple housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature that is located at the bottom of your screen to ask all of your questions. We will be looking at the Q&A for the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Our moderator today is Lauren Fick, and she will be joining us towards the end of our presentation to direct our questions to the speaker. Today's webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on our K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload additional resources related to the topic as well if you have more questions afterwards. Our website is where you will have access to the previous topics and the list of upcoming topics for the 2021 series. Be sure to like, share, and use the hashtag K-State Garden Hour to help us promote this program. Today's topic is Pruning Like a Pro, Tips for Trees and Shrubs. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Matthew McKernan. He is the horticulture agent for Sedgwick County, and we are so excited to hear what he has to say about pruning. Please give us a few moments while we transition into this presentation.
Well, thank you, Kelsey, and welcome everybody to today's K-State Garden Hour. So excited that everybody's here with us today, and even more excited to be talking about pruning. For me, pruning is always a really exciting thing because that's one of the first things we get to do each and every spring as we kind of get out of winter and get out in our gardens for the year. And so for today's K-State Garden Hour, really pleased to have the opportunity to really spend some time talking about pruning and the different ways that we can impact our plants as we prune. To give you a little overview of what we plan to talk about today, one of the first things we have to talk about is what is pruning and how are our plants going to respond to pruning. We also are then going to jump into specifics on pruning for trees, and then we'll talk about specifics for pruning for shrubs. At the end, we'll try to take all of your questions that we can and answer them live. But throughout the presentation today, please use that question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and our whole team of horticulture experts here will be trying to address those questions as we go through today. And I gotta warn you right off the bat, there's gonna be a lot of information in here today, a lot of things about plants. So be prepared and realize that we can't cover everything in the 1 hour period we have. We are going to be putting some publications in the chat box today to be able to help you. And one of those that we're gonna put in there first is gonna be all about pruning. And so a lot of the things we cover today, a lot of the diagrams you see, you'll be able to find in that publication to be able to refer back to in the future. But like I said, I'm super excited about pruning because for me, this is where spring starts. We get out of winter, we start pruning, we cut back perennials, we prune our trees and shrubs, and then growth takes off. And so I'm like everybody else, I'm first in line for spring, and so excited to be able to talk about it today. But for me, I know a lot about pruning, but sometimes it feels overwhelming. I can really relate to this photo where you're all excited to go out and prune and you've got your saw, your pruners, whatever the case may be, and you get there in front of that tree and you're like, now what do I do? It's just sometimes overwhelming. And so we'll hopefully take that and talk about the ways that we approach pruning so that it's less overwhelming and much more feasible to do when you get outside to do it. So first of all, I want to start it off talking about what is pruning. And for me, there's 3 specific things that we have to think about with pruning. Pruning is going to be intentionally wounding our trees and shrubs in a process that selectively removes parts of the limbs or branches for a specific reason. And so these are the 3 things we really want to focus on today. Pruning, we are intentionally damaging our plants by selectively removing parts of them for a specific reason. And so all 3 of those are really important to focus on. Pruning is something that's both an art and a science. We'll talk about some of the science first and the decision-making process that's involved, but part of this is also the art form and the skill of practicing over and over pruning and seeing how pruning impacts the plants that you're growing. So one of the first things that we have to talk about when we're talking about good pruning techniques is we have to start with the right plant in the right place. Because if we have the right sized plant in the right sized areas, we can really avoid a lot of the pruning that may need to be done. We don't have to worry about overgrown trees or shrubs, bushes growing up against the house if we put smaller plants in the right place. So having the right plant can really reduce the amount of work involved in pruning. But just as importantly, we have to understand what's the plant's function or purpose. What are we growing that plant for? Because how we grow or what we grow that plant for really dictates how we want to grow that plant. And so we have to understand that plant's function, but also understand how we're going to impact that plant in our pruning practices. So when we think about trees and shrubs and we think about some of the functions of those plants, there's a lot of different reasons we might try to grow trees or shrubs. And it's going to vary from person to person and situation to situation. Why I grow a shrub may be different than the reason you do. And so we have to, first of all, identify what is that purpose, because that dictates how we want to prune those trees and shrubs. So we may be pruning those trees or shrubs in order to provide shade. We may be trying to provide screening from the neighbors. Maybe we're trying to protect our property from strong winds. Maybe we're planting a thorny bush outside of our bedroom window to provide a barrier. Maybe we're trying to reduce noise off the street, provide habitat for animals. You name it, there's 1,001 different reasons that we might have a tree or shrub in our landscape. And so first of all, we have to decide why we're growing it, because growing a tree for windbreak protection is going to be much different than growing a tree for shade. And so how we prune it is going to vary. So once we've identified the function of that tree or shrub, we have to understand how pruning impacts that tree and shrub. And really there's two primary ways that trees and shrubs are going to grow. And we call this primary growth and secondary growth. Primary growth is really going to be growth that happens on the ends of branches, or think about it increasing the overall size of the plant, increases in height and width of the plant. Secondary growth is also really important in pruning, not because it changes the size of the plant itself, but it really has a lot to do with how the tree heals over after our pruning cuts are made. So secondary growth is more the growth that increases the diameter of the branches or the size of the trunk rather than the overall height or the width of the plant. And so really we are primarily focused on primary growth most of the time when we do our pruning and bringing things back down to size, but both are really important and we'll show you why. And so with primary growth, typically we are talking about growth that's happening at the end of the branches. Usually they're coming out of these buds that are either at the ends of the branches or along the sides. Typically, as you can see here in this picture, we have often on our trees and shrubs a terminal bud. And as you can see, this is much larger than any of the other buds you see growing up and down the stem. And that's primarily because these terminal buds are where the plant is going to send most of its energy, most of its hormones, most of its nutrients to put on the greatest amounts of growth. Along the branch, though, we'll also see these lateral buds, or these buds that are lower down on the branches. And those, again, are places where growth is going to occur from. Sometimes they're called lateral buds, sometimes they're called secondary buds, but they mean the same thing. But the thing we often don't think about with pruning is the buds that we can't see, and those are called latent buds or suppressed buds. And essentially those are growing points at the surface of the bark of our trees and shrubs that just lay there indefinitely. You really don't see those buds until the ideal conditions develop for that bud to start to grow and produce new growth. Not all plants are going to have these, but these are buds that can be really unruly, and we can actually encourage in our pruning cut intentionally or unintentionally, depending on how we go about pruning. So latent buds, to give you examples, they're primarily going to be things like suckers, which are the vigorous growth shoots that come off the roots or below the graft area of our trees. You can also see latent buds up on the branches, and we call these water sprouts on the above ground portion of the plant. And these are going to be areas where you get lots of vigorous growth, it's really uncontrolled growth. And the problem with these types of buds and these types of growth is it's really going to be a lot weaker. And so we want to try to avoid these types of latent bud situations as much as possible by choosing the correct pruning cuts and practices. So we did talk about secondary growth. It is important, not necessarily because it impacts the overall size of the plant, but because this is where the callus tissue and wound healing comes from. This is ideally what we want to see once we're done with all of our pruning cuts on any kind of plant that we do, is where the tree or the plant naturally heals over those wounds. And that actually happens from the secondary growth within the plant. And so I won't get too far into the science on this, but basically secondary growth comes from these two types of plant tissues: the xylem tissue, which is what we consider the wood of the plant, and the phloem tissue, which is what we consider the bark on the outer edges of the plant. The xylem transports water from the roots up to the leaves, and the phloem takes the sugars made by photosynthesis from the leaves down to the roots. And it's these two areas where all of this transport happens. And it's in a very small area of the wood of the tree, or the trunk of the tree, called the vascular cambium. And basically this is where these two tissues meet and new layers are formed. And this is important for secondary growth because this is where all the callus tissue or healing comes from on our trees and shrubs after pruning is done. So to help you visualize that, the vascular cambium is this very thin layer right here where the wood and the bark come together. So as we're pruning, we have to be very, very careful to do as minimal damage to this thin line as possible, because this is where all of our wound healing is going to develop from. As new layers of bark are produced on the outside of this line and new layers of wood tissue are produced on the inside of this line. Because ultimately, this is what we want to see this vascular cambium do. We want to see it produce this callus tissue or healing that covers all of these wounds so that decay, rot, insects aren't able to get into the tree or the shrub and cause damage or negatively impact growth. And so if we make those pruning cuts at the right location, we can really encourage that good type of healing growth. So just to recap pruning, I want to give you a trick question here, and I'll give you the answer right off the bat that this is a trick. So if you have a tire swing and it's hanging 3 feet from the ground and the tree grows 6 inches taller every year, how high off the ground will that tire swing be in 10 years? And just like I mentioned, this is a trick question because that tire swing is always going to be 3 feet off the ground or pretty close to it. The growth that happens in our trees and shrubs happens on the ends of the branches rather than in the middle, so that the branch that tire swing hangs on is always going to be in the same location for the lifetime of that tree. It may change a little bit higher or lower off the ground depending on that secondary growth that increases the trunk diameter, but that's just not how growth works. It's always going to be at the same height. This is what secondary growth can look like if we're not careful. Again, we're focused more on the positive healing that happens from secondary growth rather than maybe eating the benches or other things in the landscape. So I want to jump right into tree pruning and talk about how we need to address pruning trees and shrubs correctly. Just like we mentioned, it's important to identify what's the function of that plant and to not put the wrong plant in the wrong place, because this type of tree next to our power lines is always going to require large amounts of pruning to keep it in check based on what we have to have in the area. So we want to try with pruning as much as possible to embrace the tree's natural shape. And with most of our trees, they're going to have one of two natural shapes. There are going to be exceptions, of course, but most deciduous trees and evergreens are going to have one of two natural habits or shapes. The first is going to be excurrent, and these are going to be trees that have this strong central leader, one trunk that goes pretty clearly from the base all the way at ground level, all the way to the top of the tree. And I remember this because excurrent has 3 straight lines, so if you flip it on its side, you have that strong central leader. The opposite of that is going to be our trees that have a decurrent growth shape, and these are going to be trees that have multiple scaffolding branches and not necessarily one strong central leader. And again, if you turn that D sideways, you kind of get these D-shaped growth patterns. And it's important to distinguish the two because how we prune one is going to be different than how we prune the other. Typically, our excurrent growth trees are going to have that strong central leader, and that's going to include trees like pines, oaks, sweet gums, bald cypress, the list goes on and on. But ideally with these types of trees, as much as possible, we want to encourage one strong central leader all the way from top to bottom in that tree so that we have good, strong branches and branch attachment. On the other hand, with our decurrent growth trees, these are going to have more of a rounded shape. And they're going to have multiple scaffolding branches that create that tree shape. And these are going to include trees like maples, ash, honey locust, elm, walnut, crab apples, red buds. All of those trees are going to typically be a little bit more rounded. And so again, we want to have a strong trunk structure in those trees, but we have to keep in mind that they're not going to naturally lend themselves to one strong central trunk all the way up, and they are going to have this tendency to branch out. And just to give you an example of what those look like, again, your pines are a great example of excurrent trees where they have that strong central leader, and our decurrent shaped trees are going to have more of that rounded branch habit. So we want to try to encourage this strong central leader as much as possible when pruning our trees, especially for our excurrent trees. So again, won't get too bogged down in the science behind the pruning, but we want to get to the art of it here too, and actually get to making some of those pruning cuts and creating sticks, especially for our four-legged friends. So I think one of the big questions that people ask is, when do I prune? When's the ideal time to get started? And really now is an ideal time for most trees and shrubs. Kind of this late winter to early spring before a lot of growth begins in our trees and shrubs is ideal for most all tree and shrub pruning. The only exception to that rule is going to be things that bloom really early in the spring. Things like lilacs, crepe myrtles, red buds, all of those trees and shrubs that are going to be blooming in the next couple weeks. You can still go ahead and prune them now, but if you do, you have to realize that you're pruning out the flowers that are going to be blooming in a few weeks. And so if you're willing to sacrifice the flowers to get the pruning done, perfectly fine. Those plants will regrow new flower buds and they'll bloom perfectly next spring, but you will have a decreased amount of flowers this year. If you want to enjoy those flowers to the max, ideally what we'd recommend in those types of situations is pruning immediately after they're done flowering. So kind of in the early May timeframe, usually most of our spring flowering things are done. And so with pruning trees, beyond when to prune, we want to talk about 4 major rules of thumb. Again, these are rules of thumb guidance rather than hard and fast laws, but these are the types of things we want to keep in mind when we approach tree and shrub pruning. So when it comes to tree pruning, generally we never want to remove more than 1/3 of the tree's overall branches. By removing too much of the tree at once, what happens is we're reducing the amount of leaves that that tree has, and those leaves create sugars through photosynthesis that are really important for trees' growth. So with pruning, we want to do this continually over time so that we're gradually pruning that tree back over time and not making drastic reductions to the overall tree's size or shape. We can prune up to about half of the tree's canopy if we really have a tree that's gone unpruned for a while, but ideally that 1/3 rule, or not removing more than 1/3 of the overall branches, is what we want to try to stick to. In this 1/3 rule though, dead branches don't count. So we can prune out dead branches any time of the year, and we don't have to worry about them counting towards the overall branch total because they're growing, or they're not growing, and so they're not producing leaves for photosynthesis. One of the things that I think is going to be important for us to really focus on this year, because we had those cold temperatures in February, we have to decide if those branches are really dead or maybe just the leaves burnt because of the cold temperatures. A lot of our semi-evergreen shrubs or things that are marginally hardy may have experienced some more dieback this year than normal because of those extreme February cold temperatures. So things like euonymus, nandina, blue atlas cedar, a lot of those plants have brown leaves on them. But that doesn't necessarily mean the branch is dead. So before you get out and really aggressively prune those trees or shrubs, I'd encourage you to go out, take your fingernail, a small pocket knife, and lightly scratch the bark on some of those branches. Ideally, what you want to see is this bright green tissue, flexible branches. And even if the leaves look bad, or you see some of the browning on those needles, let that plant go for a little bit before you prune, because the green plant tissue indicates that that branch is still alive and ideally will send out some more growth here in the next few weeks and months as we start to get into spring and summer. So just because it looks bad right now, you may want to wait and see before you give up or do some really heavy pruning on some of those trees and shrubs. We also really want to focus on branch size when it comes to pruning. And it's in just about every scenario best to prune a branch back when they're still small. The smaller, the better. And that's why gradual pruning over time is also really helpful with this as well. And one of the reasons this is important is because the larger and the older those branches get and the bigger they get in size, the more surface area those branches have. And so that means it takes longer for the callus tissue and the healing to seal over those branches. And so that really leads to slower healing, and those trees then become more susceptible to decay or other problems. So regular pruning really reduces the need to remove some of those large branches. And so we want to try to regularly prune and eliminate pruning large branches as much as possible. And this is a great example here. You can see this large cut that was made on this tree. And the large cut means that we're leaving a large wound. And you can see the callus tissue forming from that secondary growth along the edges, but it's going to take a while before it's able to heal over that entire area. And as you can see, decay has actually gotten to that center of that branch first and created this nice home for our little owl. And so by pruning back branches when they're small, we can avoid this type of scenario that might weaken the tree or shorten its overall lifespan. With branch size, we also typically want to keep the branches smaller than that central trunk. So ideally, all of our branches should be half the size or less, half the diameter or less of the trunk itself. This is going to allow us to heal over those wounds as quickly as possible when we do our pruning, but is also really going to lead to branches that are most strongly attached to the tree and less likely to have injury during let's say windstorms, ice storms, things like that, weather events. When it comes to the branches in our tree, typically we identify branches in one of two categories. That's either our scaffolding branches, which are the largest diameter permanent branches. They're going to create that tree structure. And we also have temporary branches. And these are lower branches on the tree that are really critical in the tree's early years and formation, but ultimately something we have to remove in order to be able to mow under or walk under those branches. So with our scaffolding branches, those branches that we want to be the permanent structure of the tree, ideally we want to select 5 to 9 of those branches to be the permanent branches to create that tree structure. Ideally, they need to be at least a foot apart, and the larger the tree, the more spacing apart we want to have from those branches. Ideally, we want those scaffolding branches to be on all sides of the tree so that it's kind of a nice round shape. And we also want to have a good angle away from the trunk that those branches are going to form, typically in that 45 to 60 degree angle. In contrast, those temporary branches are going to be these lower branches down low on the trunk. Again, they are critical in the tree's early growth and development, but are ultimately something we want to be able to remove in order to walk down the bike path or mow under the tree or get up the sidewalk into the house. And so these branches are really critical because they're producing carbohydrates and sugars through photosynthesis. And what that's really going to do is it's going to strengthen the tree's growth, increase the amount of growth that that tree puts on, and also helps increase the diameter of the trunk more quickly. These lower branches are also important for protecting the tree from sun scald, which is a winter injury that happens on the southwest sides of our tree trunks. And these are also going to be important for providing protection against physical injury, things that deer might cause by rubbing up against it, or maybe us with our weed eaters or cars or other animals. But the problem with these temporary branches is they're always going to be at this low height. And so we want to prune these trees up gradually so that they can still do the good things for the tree, but we want to remove them before they get to 2 inches in diameter. Oftentimes we may need to control their size before we completely remove them, but if they're too low for us to get under when they're small, they're going to be too low when we get a large tree later on. So if I have to use my hard hat to get under those trees when they're small and young, I'm still going to need my hard hat to get under those temporary branches when the tree is older. Most of our trees, we're going to want usually at least 7 foot of clearance from the ground up to where those permanent lower scaffolding branches start. So in most cases, especially for large trees, anything under 7 feet, you can usually consider a temporary branch and something we want to try to gradually remove before it gets to that 2-inch diameter. Again, though, it's extremely critical that we do this gradually. Another rule of thumb is just like that 1/3 rule we talked about earlier. We never want to expose more than 1/3 of the trunk or remove the branches on the lower 1/3 of the trunk without having 2/3 of the tree height having branches on it. So to give you a more solid example, the tree needs to be at least 18 foot tall before we would have 6 foot of clearance underneath that tree. Basically 1/3 of exposed trunk, 2/3 of canopy. When we get to the types of pruning cuts that we can make to remove these temporary branches or do other pruning in the tree, typically with tree pruning, there's going to be 3 types of cuts. There's going to be the removal cut, there's going to be the reduction cut, and there's going to be the heading cut. I also have marked here the stub cut because we see that type of cut done on our trees, but this is not a good type of pruning cut that we want to make. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So the first type of pruning cut you saw there was the removal cut. And essentially these are going to be pruning cuts that we take it and we remove that branch all the way back to its point of origin or back to the trunk. Typically we're going to do this to provide clearance, as we talked about earlier, but this is also going to be important for helping us create the overall structure of our tree and establishing those permanent scaffolding branches. The next type of pruning cut, and this is the type of pruning cut we're most often going to use, and that's the reduction cut. And essentially, these are pruning cuts that reduce the overall height or width or density of the tree. And the great thing about these pruning cuts is we always prune them back to a previous growing point in the plant. It's not necessarily the trunk, but another set of buds or another branch. And the nice thing about this is we know how the plant is going to respond, because if we take it back to a previous growing point, that becomes the new dominant growing point where the tree or shrub is going to send its energy. And so we actually encourage these branches to take over. So with these reduction cuts, either we're trying to suppress the growth or the overall size on some of our branches, especially maybe on our temporary branches. We may want to use these reduction cuts to redirect growth to other areas of the tree. And we may also need to use these reduction cuts to reduce the amount of overall pruning that's done to the tree so that we can stick into that 1/3 rule. The third type of pruning cut that we see on trees is the heading cut. And generally, this is not an appropriate pruning cut that we want to see used on our landscape trees. Basically, what happens with these pruning cuts is we just randomly cut through the branch. And we do this at random locations. And this is what really encourages those latent buds that we talked about earlier that just randomly shoot out masses and masses of growth. Typically, this reduces the size of the overall tree quickly, but results in this extremely uncontrolled growth that happens as a result. So even in this picture, everything about it says stop. Try not to use this type of heading cut when possible. And as I mentioned, this results in vigorous sprouting. And as you can see in the picture here, there's just tons of growth, little new growth that occurs, bigger growth that occurs. And the problem with these is these types of latent buds that grow from these heading cuts are really going to be weak and susceptible to storm injury, stem decay, and really create a weaker tree long-term. So when we're pruning our trees, typically we avoid the heading cuts in the random branch locations because we don't want to see this type of growth occur. And another way you can think about this is maybe topping the tree. It's another common term where heading cuts are used, is topping. And I love this diagram because this is a good example of on top you have a heading cut in these first 2 pictures versus the thinning cut. Ideally with the thinning cuts or the reduction cuts, we would make the pruning cut back to a previous growing point. And because the terminal bud that was here has been removed, this previous growing point now becomes the dominant area where the tree or shrub sends its new growth. And so we know how that tree or shrub is going to respond. It sends a little bit of growth back to some of these other secondary buds that are lower on. But again, this is a much more controlled and stronger growth pattern. Whereas if we don't go back to a previous growing point and we just make these heading cuts, we get some growth out of that existing growing point. We get these random latent buds that start to pop up. And we also get these buds lower on that get triggered, lower down that get triggered. And so we have this really uncontrolled growth. That means we're going to have to go back in and do more pruning on those trees and shrubs. So those are going to be the 4 types of pruning cuts that we're most commonly going to see. And again, the removal cut and the reduction cut are really the 2 that we want to see. The stub cut is going to be very similar to a heading cut, but instead of going all the way back to the trunk, we basically leave this weird branch length that's still left behind that's hard for that tree to heal over. And those are the types of haircuts that our trees really don't like to see. And so with not only selecting the type of pruning cut that's correct, we also have to have a few cutting techniques that are going to help us as well. And so when we're pruning trees or the branches back to the trunk or back to an existing growing point, there's a specific area that we want to look for, and that's called our branch bark ridge and our branch collar. And I'll show you a picture in just a minute. And we always want to prune outside of these two areas because that's where secondary growth is going to come from and the healing is going to come from with our trees and shrubs. So the branch bark ridge is going to be the area where the branch meets the trunk. On the top side of that union, you'll see this area where the bark sticks up and is kind of prominent. You're going to be able to see this on just about every species of tree out there. It's going to be this prominent ridge of bark right here. On the bottom side of that branch, we have the branch collar. And again, that's where the branch meets the trunk or another branch. And it's going to be this rippled area of bark. It's not going to be as prominent on all species, but it's going to be there. So you may just have to look a little harder or kind of guess where you think it should be. This is always important to prune outside of these two areas so that we get the quickest and most effective healing that happens after we're done with our pruning cuts. And so just a few pictures here to help you visualize what that looks like on a couple different trees and shrubs. You can see the branch bark ridge here on top, the ripple down here at the bottom for the collar. You can see it more clearly on this side. And these are the types of areas we want to prune just on the outside of so that we get that good healing. You can also see we should have been doing some pruning earlier because our main trunk here has actually been overtaken by this side branch. And ideally this side branch should be half the diameter or smaller of our main trunk. So just to give you an example one more time here, this is our branch bark ridge, this is our branch collar, and you can almost see this imaginary line that forms right there on the branch. And that's kind of our cut here line that we want to make sure we follow when we're making our pruning cuts. And if we do this, this is what we're going to see. We're going to see that branch bark ridge and that branch collar still intact. And ultimately, this is going to lead to quick natural healing over these wounds so that we are able to prevent diseases, decay, insects from getting into those open wounds. And ideally, with a little bit of time, maybe a couple of years, ultimately those pruning cuts should heal up all the way and they just disappear into the trunk of the tree. These are good pruning cuts that have been made on this tree. Unfortunately, though, we can also gauge whether we made a bad pruning cut as well. And you can see here we have really good callus tissue or wound healing from the bottom and the sides, but we got too close and cut into the branch bark ridge on the top here because there is no healing happening here. We did a great job of staying outside the branch collar at the bottom, but basically the problem here is we're going to take that much more time in order to be able to heal over that wound. So it's just going to take longer and we're more likely to experience decay or injury within that tree. Sometimes though, we can make the correct pruning cuts at the correct location, but we can still cause damage if we are using the wrong type of pruning tool. We made the pruning cut at the right place here, but the branch was too large for the tool that we selected. And again, it's just that very thin layer of vascular cambium right where the bark and the wood meet, where all of this pruning tissue comes, or all of this healing tissue comes from. And so the proper pruning tool is also extremely critical. Excuse me. With our hand pruners, we can typically prune branches that are up to 1/2 inch in diameter. Some of our hand pruners are going to be a little larger, so they may be able to handle up to 3/4 inches in diameter, but typically 1/2 inch or less is where we need to use our hand pruners. If we're going to use loppers, typically our loppers, again, depending on the size, are going to handle branches that are up to 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches in diameter. Anything that's up to or larger than 2 inches in diameter, we need to pull out a saw, whether that's a handsaw, a chainsaw, it really doesn't matter, but we need the handsaw or the saw so that we make as clean of cut as possible to do the least amount of damage to our tree or shrub that we're leaving behind. On the small branches that we're pruning off, ideally what we want to do is sort of at a 45-degree angle with our loppers or pruners. If we have buds that are on both sides of the branches, or what we call opposite buds, that may be more of a straight cut. But on trees and shrubs that have alternate branching, and that's going to be the majority of trees and shrubs, we would make it at about a 45-degree angle. We don't want to be too angular because that's so much more surface area that the wound healing has to cover. And we also don't want to get too low or too high because we don't want to damage that bud. And we don't want to have dieback occur until that callus tissue is able to form back at that branch bark ridge and branch collar. On our larger branches, especially when we're talking about saw cuts, Typically, we're going to encourage this 3-cut method on anything that's 1.5 inches, 2 inches or larger in diameter. And this is a 3-cut system so that we basically are going to do the least amount of damage to the tree or the trunk or the part of the plant that we're leaving behind. And the biggest damage that we usually see is when bark strips or peels down the trunk once we make our pruning cuts. And this is intended to avoid that. And so the first cut we make is on the underside of the branch. We'll first start by figuring out where we want our finishing cut to be. And we're going to go 12 to 15 inches, maybe just as short as 6 inches, somewhere in that range, past where we want the final cut to be. It's going to be made on the underside of the branch so that it prevents that bark from stripping. And it only needs to be 1/3 of the way up the branch or halfway up the branch, again, just to break the bark so that it doesn't peel down the trunk. The second cut is going to go past that undercut that we made. And basically with this cut, we're just removing the weight of the branch. And so if bark stripping is going to happen, it's going to happen with this cut, and it's going to get stopped by that first cut we made. And then the final cut that we make is the correct pruning cut, right outside that branch bark ridge and right outside that branch collar. And this will be the final cut that we make. And again, this is what's going to get us good healing and do the least amount of damage to our trees and shrubs that we leave behind. If we really focus on making the correct pruning cuts at the correct locations, we don't need to worry about tars or paints or any kind of sealants on our wounds. These can actually create favorable conditions for decay. And so we really want to focus on making the correct pruning cuts in the correct locations so that this isn't even something we need to think about. It's going to be best to leave those pruning cuts dry and untreated. And again, focus on making the correct pruning cut in the correct location to get the best pruning or the best wound healing possible. But if you get to these situations where you're feeling in over your head, don't be afraid to hire a professional or look for somebody who is going to be able to help you. Typically, when we're looking for tree care professionals, there's 2 things that we're going to recommend. We're going to typically recommend a certified arborist. And typically this means that they have training and certification or education in order to receive that certification, and usually have to go through continuing education in order to maintain that certification. We also want to look for tree pruning professionals that are insured, just in case damage is to occur when pruning. It's not your responsibility, but theirs. And as K-State Research and Extension, we try to be as unbiased as possible and provide you research-based information. So we don't recommend any one particular pruning company or organization, but there are 2 organizations that certify arborists in the state of Kansas. And that's going to be the Kansas Arborist Association and the International Society of Arboriculture. And you should have both of those links to their websites in the chat. And basically, we encourage people to generally refer to these lists when looking for an arborist. Again, we're not recommending anyone specific from these lists, but because they're trained and have these certifications, usually these professionals should be more knowledgeable about tree care and how to make the correct pruning cuts in the correct locations. The certifications do not speak to their qualifications necessarily, or excuse me, they speak to their qualifications and not necessarily a guarantee of their workmanship or the job that they're going to do. But in general, with these certified and trained industry professionals, usually you'll get a lot better pruning as a result. Here at the end of our presentation, we'll jump into some tips on shrub pruning as well. And again, there's K-State publications that you'll be able to find and reference back to, and those links are going to be posted in the chat. When we talk about shrub pruning, though, this is not shrub pruning. This is a butcher job on our poor little shrub. And this tree is never, or this shrub is not going to be able to recover its natural shape after pruning like this. This is also not shrub pruning. I know it looks fun, and this guy could be my friend, but this is not the type of shrub pruning that we're going to be talking about here. Just like tree pruning, a lot of the basics are going to be the same. Again, we have to first establish what's the function of that shrub. Is it for screening or is it a barrier? Whatever that scenario is. We expect the same types of plant responses from our shrubs as we do our trees. Again, typically we want to follow the 1/3 rule, and we want to make the same types of pruning cuts that we would to our trees. Using the same pruning techniques, same timing for pruning, and same pruning tools are all going to apply the same from tree pruning to shrub pruning. Just to recap on the when to prune your shrubs, prune them immediately after they're done flowering. So our summer flowering shrubs and trees, things like spirea, roses, hibiscus, crepe myrtles, rose of Sharon, even some of our hydrangeas, things that bloom in the middle of the summer or in the fall, now is the ideal time to prune them because they put out or they create their flower buds on new growth or the growth that they'll put on this spring. Where on the other hand, our spring flowering shrubs, things like forsythia, lilac, viburnum, quince, azalea, weigelia, rhododendrons, anything that's going to bloom here in the next couple weeks at the beginning of spring, ideally we want to wait until those are immediately done flowering because again, if we prune them now, it'll be perfectly fine, but we're going to reduce the amount of flowers that they produce this spring. For me, sometimes it just is a matter of I can get the pruning done this spring, so I'm going to do it and I'm willing to sacrifice those flowers. But just be aware that if you prune those spring flowering shrubs now, that's what's going to happen. The same types of pruning cuts are going to apply with our trees, just like they do our shrubs. And I'll give you a couple quick examples here. Our thinning and reduction cut, just like trees, are essentially used to reduce the overall size of the tree or shrub's growth. And generally with that, we're pruning it back to a previous growing point, often what we're going to call these lateral buds or secondary buds, lower down on the branches. And the great thing is, wherever these buds are, we know that's where new growth is going to happen from. So let's say, for example, this white box is our house and we have a branch here. If we're leaving these buds that are facing away from the house, we know that we're going to direct that shrub's growth or that tree's growth away from the house rather than back into the house if we leave this bud here. So again, keeping in mind where those buds are pointed indicates where new growth is going to occur. So this is what thinning or reduction cuts are going to look like on our shrubs. Really, we want to look for things that are crossing branches, rubbing branches, and have that growth pointed outward in an outward direction so that we get a good overall shape and structure of our plant. Here's a great example of what those thinning cuts look like. We have this huge overgrown plant that's way taller than the house. We need to bring it back down to size. And so we're using those thinning cuts or pruning cuts back to previous growing points in the tree to control the size. With shrubs, we also have this type of pruning cut though that we call the renewal cut. And this is really important for multi-stemmed shrubs, things like lilacs, dogwoods, forsythias, quince, barberry, viburnums, things with multiple trunks. Ideally, what we want to do for these types of shrubs is we want to do this renewal cut where we go in and we prune out the 1/3 of the largest branches that are coming out of the ground. Typically, these larger branches are going to produce less flowers and have less vigorous growth. So by removing those 1/3 of the largest branches, we encourage new growth to occur, and that's going to have a lot more flower power and performance on our shrubs. Some plants, though, are really going to favor what we call a rejuvenation cut. And this is what you could also consider a really heavy renewal cut, where instead of taking out just the 3rd largest, we're cutting the whole thing back. And essentially in these rejuvenation cuts, we cut back the trunks of our shrubs, typically till we have about 6 to 12 inches, maybe a little bit larger, and we expect new growth to come off of those shrubs each year. Crepe myrtle is a great example of this, where crepe myrtle will put out feet of growth every year. And so we can just prune them back to a couple inches to a couple feet off the ground and let new growth come. The mounding spirea that you see in the landscape are a great thing. Just mow them off at the ground and they'll send up a lot more healthy, vigorous growth and a lot better flowers by having this type of intense pruning. But we can also do this on things like Manhattan euonymus that might be overgrown, vitex, butterfly bush. It's a very similar concept with our ornamental grasses as well, where we're just kind of cutting them off just above ground level to really get the best, healthiest plants to come back. And so I got a couple pictures here of an example of euonymus that's growing at our office in Sedgwick County. You can see this plant, it was after a really cold winter in 2017, so it had the same type of winter burn on the leaves that we see this year. But you can see these branches are all the way over the tops of the windows. And so we take these rejuvenation cuts and basically just leave sort of a structure of stumps below. And euonymus, it seems extreme, but euonymus will grow back wonderfully after this type of pruning. It's very vigorous. So this is what it looks like in March after our pruning cuts. And by the end of the summer on October 1st, we already have a ton of plant growth. Now we could have come in here one more time and pruned, then did some thinning cuts to kind of control the overall size or shape. But again, at our office, we have so many display gardens that we can't give everything the same amount of maintenance we would in our own backyards. So even by July 1st, you can see halfway into the summer, just a few months later, how much growth has returned to these shrubs. And they can really handle the rejuvenation pruning. Barberry is another one that, again, you may want to prune out more of like a third of the largest branches, but it can handle heavier pruning. You can see this barberry here is about 6 feet tall in this picture. We took it down to just a few small branches that came back, and it really was encouraged to send up new growth from the roots. The color was a lot better, and it really got to about 3 to 4 feet in height in just that first summer after we were done pruning. We can use heading cuts on our shrubs, and typically the heading cut is what we're going to do when we shear off our shrubs. And basically we just remove the tops of those branches at random points. This can be a pruning technique that you use, but again, what we get is all of this vigorous growth that comes back, and it's often really uncontrolled. And so the heading cuts, just like they do on our trees, the heading cuts encourage this unexpected plant response where all of this random growth happens from all over our trees and shrubs. Just like that picture we saw earlier, we get a lot of explosion of growth rather than directed growth or controlled growth when we use those heading cuts. Sometimes it's unavoidable though. We had some overgrown burning bushes along the backside of our building. And when we went in to prune, there was no growth lower down or no interior branches where we could cut back to. So we made some random heading cuts, and we got new growth that's coming up from the ground, new growth that's popping up randomly along the branches. Burning bush can be overgrown. It doesn't respond as well as like euonymus does to these intense heading cuts. But again, once we're overgrown, we have to do something to either remove the plant or bring it back down to size. And sometimes those heading cuts are necessary. I want to touch just briefly on shearing before we wrap up today. Shearing is going to be using those heading cut techniques either with some kind of hedge clippers or large pruners. And typically a lot of our plants aren't really conducive to shearing because they destroy the natural shape of the plant. And once that's done, it's really hard to get a natural shape back out of those plants. And so if you have to do shearing, here's a few tips that you want to follow. Every time you prune, you typically want to leave at least 1 inch of the previous season's growth on it so that we're helping stimulate new growth. We also want to avoid, especially on our evergreens, what's called the dead zone. And this is the interior portion of the shrub or the tree, our evergreen trees especially, where there are no dormant buds. And so once we prune back into those areas, we're not going to get new growth to fill in. So arborvitaes and junipers are definitely something we have to be mindful of, this dead zone when pruning. When shearing shrubs, we also have to be really careful about the shape that we prune them in. We always want them to be wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. Regardless of if it's a box shape or a rounded shape, we always want to make sure they're wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. And that's because the leaves down there need to be able to photosynthesize. And so if it's done wrong or incorrectly and wider at the top of the shrub actually blocks out the sunlight to the leaves on the bottom half of the shrub. And so oftentimes the leaves on the bottom portions of these shrubs are going to drop off and going to be bare, because the sunlight just can't effectively get down to it because of the incorrect shape of that shrub. If we have evergreen trees, especially pines that we want to do some heavy pruning on because they don't have those interior dormant buds, we want to prune them in the early to late spring, right as those candles or the new growth is elongating. Typically, as those candles are going to elongate, we're going to cut them back 1/2 to 1/3 of their overall length. And that's going to encourage denseness in the shrub. Again, be careful not to prune them too severely so that you open up the dead zone in the interior of those pines, because they're not going to fill in once that's exposed. So I know we threw out a lot of plant information at you all today, and I want to thank you all for attending, and we'll get to some questions here. But before we do, I just want to wish you all a happy St. Patrick's Day. Hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'm more than happy to answer some of the questions that everybody might have. And I know we're also going to drop one more publication into the chat box, and that's on pruning roses. There are some specific nuances with pruning roses, and so I'd encourage you to check out that publication to learn about some of the specific things we might need to think about for roses. Thank you all.
Okay, Matt, are you ready for the question and answer?
Bring it on. I'm sure there's lots of them.
Okay, so the first one is from Topeka Master Gardener, who is currently living in Texas, and they took an outdoor, what was called a corn plant, which suffered some freeze damage. They did some research and pruned the stem stalks to below the soft portions at hardwood. 2 weeks later, the stems have now softened below the cuts. What should they do to save this plant?
And that's a great question. And I think a lot of people are going to have that same question this year because of some of those intense freezes we had in February. So just like we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, I would encourage you to lightly scratch the bark on the branches of that tree or shrub so that you can see if there's green plant tissue. If there's green plant tissue, that means you should get some new growth that's going to come from those areas, but it may just take a little while for you to be able to see that. So just kind of wait and see is honestly the best thing that we can recommend at this point in time. And if you see dieback that's continuing down the plant, continue to make those pruning cuts back to a previous point of either green plant tissue or a previous growing point in the plant. Great question.
Great, thank you, Matt. So the next question, and I couldn't find anything on this, so maybe you know, how do you prevent the latent buds on Sargentina crab apples?
Sure. So a lot of our trees, what people may not realize is are grafted. So the above ground portion of the tree and the below ground root system are two different types of trees. And we see this on crab apples all the time. And we combine these different types of plant parts together to get benefits like drought tolerance from the roots and disease tolerance from the above ground portion of the tree. But some of those plants like crab apples are going to have a tendency to send up a lot of those latent buds or those suckers. And honestly, there's not a good way to control them. The best thing you can do is just be very vigilant and routine about pruning them off. Try to get them back as close to possible to the main roots, and that may help some of those from coming back as frequently. There are plant growth regulators that you can find to spray on those suckers. Basically, it's a product called Sucker Stopper, and this will potentially reduce the amount of suckers, but it's not going to eliminate them. It basically just suppresses their growth. We want to be very, very careful though on those suckers not to spray any kind of herbicides or plant killers because those suckers are attached to the root system of the tree. So if we kill those suckers with a glyphosate-based product or a brush and stump killer, that's going to kill the entire tree, not just the suckers. So pruning regularly is really, unfortunately, one of the best ways to do that.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, the next one's kind of a fun question. Is there anything to pruning in conjunction with the moon phases, such as a farmer's almanac that would best days to prune and or prune to encourage versus prune to discourage growth?
I don't know about that, to be honest with you. I don't think we have to necessarily be as concerned about the moon phases as much as maybe the time of year. I think that's probably the important takeaway from that question. Especially on things like the roses, they really need to wait until we've gotten past that last frost or freeze before we do a lot of pruning because they're going to be more susceptible to cold injury. One of the other things that we often see is with our evergreens, things like boxwoods. People may want to prune those in the late fall, right before we get into winter or late summer. And what we often see is when we make those late pruning cuts in the season, we often experience more dieback or injury during the winter because those pruning cuts haven't had a chance to heal over before we get to all of this intense cold. So I think timing is really important. So yes, I think there is some benefit to that, but I think it's more based on the weather maybe than the moon cycles.
Very good. Okay, the next question, we had several people ask about this. It says, I've heard sycamores described as self-pruning because of their tendency to drop entire branches. Would intentional pruning reduce this, or is it just a random process by the tree?
And that's a great question. And I think a lot of our trees and shrubs may create dead branches or have some branch dieback because they grow a lot of branches on the interior portion of the tree. And so as that tree continues to grow in an outward direction, those interior branches get in there and they are not able to receive sunlight in order to photosynthesize. And the tree knows this, and so they're not productive, they're not effective. And so the tree naturally sloughs off or loses those branches so that it can really focus on growth on the outside of the tree. So I think we can clean up some of our messy trees by having regular pruning happening to them. to make sure that we're focusing on the good scaffolding branches throughout the tree and reducing some of those interior branches that are eventually, like I said, probably going to die or slough off as they're becoming ineffective and shaded out.
Great, thank you. So the next question, I'm sure many people have experienced this before. How long does it take an arborvitae to come back after 2 or 3 branches have been killed by bagworms?
And that's a great question. Arborvitae typically doesn't have a lot of dormant buds inside the plant. And so we want to make sure that we figure out where that growth is going to come from. So it's either going to have to come down from surrounding branches or over from surrounding branches. Arborvitae does have sometimes the ability to send out some new branches from the trunk. It'll try, but unfortunately, once we create those holes, it may be hard on our evergreens to fill those holes.
Okay, thank you. The next question, we've had a couple people ask as well. If trees need to be pruned near or under electrical wires and you're not comfortable attempting yourself, should you contact a professional or an arborist or the service provider?
That's a great question. And one of the things you might keep in mind is if the trees are on a right of way, especially like in urban areas like I'm in, if the trees are planted on the right of way, the city may actually own those trees. And so if they're on city property or in the right of way, sometimes you can contact your local forestry service and they will come out and do those prunings because they're considered street trees rather than on your personal property. And so that might be the first place to start, is check with your municipality to see if they have a tree pruning service that they can provide, and they might be able to direct you a little bit better too.
Great. Okay, another question that's been asked, how often should I prune? Always, yearly, sometimes monthly, weekly?
And that's a great question. It's going to depend on the plant and how much growth it puts out. I would say try to prune at least once a year to make sure you're just looking for problems and avoiding making some of those larger pruning cuts later on. If you love pruning like I do, you may be out there with your snippers every week, just doing a little bit of pruning here and there, and there's nothing wrong with that. Do as much or as little as you want, but like I said, I'd focus on at least once a year so that you can avoid some of those major pruning cuts later on.
Awesome. Next question, when thinning/reduction pruning back to 2 lateral buds, do you remove one of them, leaving only the one facing outward? I would assume this is probably geared towards roses, is what I think when I think of that.
Yeah, so if you have buds that are opposite on the branch or basically on equal sides, either side of the branch, you can leave both or you can select just one. If you're pruning roses, typically we encourage the outward growth away from the center of the plant. So you may want to select just one. And I know it was also noted in the comments that I've mentioned roses waiting till after the late spring freezes. And roses are different than rows of Sharon. So don't get those two confused in the hibiscus family there.
Okay, one of the questions that has come up, and I think I answered it earlier in the question, but I'll have you go ahead and answer it again. What is the best time to prune an oak tree, and when should you not prune an oak tree?
And that's a great question. Typically, I would plan to prune the tree when it's dormant. Some of the arborists that you talk to will have specific times that they want to prune because they want to avoid potentially spreading diseases. And oak wilt is not a huge problem in Kansas, but it is a disease that's out there in the United States and is of concern. And so sometimes you'll see specific recommendations on when to prune or not to prune to help reduce the spread of that disease. And off the top of my head, I apologize, I can't tell you when those recommendations are, but if you look up diseases like oak wilt, there should be some very specific information on when to prune oaks.
Great. Okay, I'm going to make this the last question, and it's kind of a fun one again. So if a maple tree has died, yet there are still suckers coming up, can one of those be used to replace the tree?
That is an excellent question. And if you have suckers that are coming from the root system, yes, you can prune those into a new tree. What I will warn you though is because a lot of trees like maples and crabapples are grafted, the plant that comes from the roots of the tree may be very different than the existing tree that you had before. And so you may not get the same characteristics, the same fall color, the same disease tolerance from the suckers that come off of the roots. But if it's anything that happens lower down on the trunk above the graft where the top and the bottom meet, those should be fine to prune into a new tree. And if you're willing to see what comes up, do it.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all we had time for, Matt. We did not get to everyone's questions, so we apologize, but we will do our best, Matt will, to answer those via email, or if you have questions and they didn't get answered, please feel free to email your local extension office or Matt. I think we can put his email address in the chat for you all. We thank you so much for joining us. Kelsey, did you have anything you wanted to add, or Matt?
All righty. Well, thanks, Matt. Once again, thank you everybody for joining us at the K-State Garden Hour. Our next session will be April 7th, and we will be covering raised beds and container gardening. Be sure to visit the K-State Garden Hour website to see all those upcoming topics. Once again, this session was recorded and will be posted on our website by tomorrow afternoon. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Please don't hesitate to email us at ksuemg@ksu.edu. Once we end this webinar, there will be a survey that pops up, and we would like you to fill that out, and because we graciously appreciate your feedback and hope to see you all again at the next Garden Hour. Everybody have a great week and a happy St. Patrick's Day.